evening, welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up on the program. Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill apologises for the immigration debacle as she announces a new migration strategy. Full details coming up. Also, how the left has mistaken a death cult for a liberation movement. Columnist Paul Kelly will join me to discuss the moral confusion confounding the Albanese government and how it's leading to an anti-Semitism crisis. Plus, the race is on to replace Anastasia Palaszczuk. Joe Hildebrand and Andrew Carswell will be on later to talk about what happened behind the scenes to make the Queensland Premier call it quits. We start tonight with explosive revelations about Brittany Higgins' lawyer, that he gave suggestions on how she should answer tough questions during her cross-examination in the ongoing defamation trial. We can tonight reveal that high-profile solicitor Leon Zweier met with Higgins' fiancé David Shiraz the night before her testimony last Tuesday and issued clear advice on what she should tell the judge under oath the next morning. In bombshell revelations, Zweier is captured on tape and was overheard by witnesses discussing with Higgins' fiancé Shiraz on how she should respond when questioned about her Commonwealth payout and inconsistencies in her story. Tonight, we will play you those sensational recordings. If Zweier's advice was communicated to Higgins, it would be a potential contempt of court in defiance of a federal court judge. Witnesses should not receive coaching during their period of cross-examination, a rule reiterated by Justice Michael Lee during the trial. But Zweier told Shiraz,
I'm told by my lawyer. That's what she said. I've been told by my lawyer.
This conversation took place in the Park Hyatt Hotel lobby bar in Sydney last Monday night. Higgins was not present, but her constant courtroom companion Emma Webster was there, along with Zweier and Shiraz. The next morning, about 12 hours later, the group entered court together for the defamation case brought by Bruce Lerman against Network 10 and Lisa Wilkinson. The recordings were made by an unrelated party who happened to be sitting in the public bar. The witness has no connection to the case. The group was speaking loudly and made no effort to keep the nature of their conversation private. Zweier is a well-known and highly respected Melbourne lawyer known as Mr. Fix-It from the prestigious firm Arnold Bloch Leibler. In the audio recording, there are numerous examples of Zweier and David Shiraz discussing how Higgins should respond to specific questions. In an extraordinary admission, Zweier says that he, not a doctor, wrote Higgins' draft medical report submitted after the collapse of the criminal trial. The report argued the case that her mental health was too fragile for a retrial. It's unclear if this medical report was also submitted as part of Higgins' claim for compensation from the Commonwealth, where she received $2.4 million in a deed of settlement. Zweier can also be heard in the tapes telling Shiraz and Webster how Higgins' barrister, King's Counsel Matt Collins, would intervene the following day to stop certain lines of questioning. At the start of Tuesday's cross-examination, Bruce Lerman's barrister, Stephen Whybrow, asked Brittany Higgins whether she'd received any tips on giving evidence this week from anybody. Higgins replied, no. Justice Michael Lee also said to Higgins before she left the stand on Friday afternoon, and I quote, "So if you could please be back here on Tuesday at 10 a.m, and I just remind you over the course of that break, you are not to discuss your evidence given in these proceedings with anyone." Sky News is not suggesting that Leon Zweier intended his advice to be passed on to Higgins, and there's no evidence that Shiraz did so. But around 9:30 p.m. last Monday night, Zweier told Shiraz how Higgins should respond to questions.
She's asking you a little bit of what was the privilege? You know, Your Honour, I'm told by my lawyer. That's what she should say. I've been told by my lawyer I don't need to discuss the legal.
That comment related to questions about Brittany Higgins' public commentary on the courthouse steps after the criminal mistrial. Lerman's barrister Stephen Whybrow wanted to ask whether her remarks were intended to scuttle a rigged trial. Justice Michael Lee said he'd decide over the weekend whether to allow that line of questioning. So Zweier was suggesting to Shiraz that Higgins say that she did receive legal advice about this, but that it was privileged, Your Honour, and she didn't have to discuss it. Well, David Shiraz then asked, if the judge rules out that line of questioning, then what else will he ask about? As you'll hear now, Zweier says that Higgins may be asked about the Commonwealth settlement, which we now know is $2.4 million. But Zweier advises Shiraz that Higgins should answer that the terms are confidential. He says to be very wary around these questions. Have a listen.
Let's say the judge rules out that one. It's not a whole thing. Let's give it to him. He goes to book inconsistencies, he goes to be very wary in terms of confidential. We shouldn't say talk about it because it's confidential. The judge said that we should not say it's legal advice. Just tell the truth. The minute she goes into that thinking in public one's and they don't want to testify, it's all irrelevant. I know, it's not relevant.
On another occasion during their discussion, Zweier says Higgins could cite legal professional privilege in the stand and that she should give evidence saying that it wasn't about the money.
She doesn't have the way of legal professional. She's the same as just so enraged when I ran, so enraged. It's not whether it'd be well enough or not well enough. It was just a gut reaction. It's not about money. She just says she doesn't ever have any way of legal advice. It's legal advice.
We're right now hearing sensational tapes of Brittany Higgins' lawyer, Leon Zweier, discussing with her fiancé, David Shiraz, how she should respond to questions during her cross-examination. If the instructions were passed on to Higgins, it would be a clear contempt of court in defiance of a federal court judge. We're going through the audio, which was recorded last Monday night, December the 4th, in a busy public bar, the lobby bar at Sydney's Park Hyatt Hotel. Zweier tells Shiraz during their conversation that Higgins should keep her answers short, particularly if she's asked questions about making money from her story.
Listen to the question and keep the answers short. But be careful. Be a different person. No, I know.
Shiraz and Zweier also discuss whether the judge understands Higgins, and they talk about how she's an unemotional witness unless speaking about the rape allegation. They also refer to criticism that she turned her rape allegation into a multimedia story, and they say that that's belittling.
So when it gets back to the rape, what is it the judge doesn't like about it? You can tell her, I can tell her. No, but what did she do for a reason? To convert it to a movie school. It's so manipulative. What she does is she just tells her it's been raped. And she turns into a multimedia kind of stupid part. She does, and so it's her. She's not true. She's not sobbing. She's not crying. But when she talks about the actual rape, she's like, surely he can see that. But when he's the violence that comes out, it's so deliberate. Well, it was deliberate because if she's going to blow up her life, shameless parliament, she wanted to make sure it landed.
During the defamation trial, both Higgins and Lerman have been accused of giving inconsistent evidence. Legal experts say both their credibilities have been damaged. Zweier and Shiraz discuss the inconsistencies in the evidence of both Higgins and Lerman, but decide that his are worse than hers because his inconsistencies, they say, are at the heart of the matter, where hers are around the periphery. They also discussed the testimony of other witnesses and which individuals would be good for their case.
The inconsistencies around the periphery, they're not correct, they're not the heart. These are all of them. The security department.
In a revelation that will shock the public, Zweier says that he, and not a doctor, drafted Higgins' medical report, which detailed her anxiety and suicide attempt. He read aloud the medical report to the group after opening his laptop at the public bar. He says, "Let me brief you," before reading a statement from the doctors that he says he received on the 9th of October.
Let me read you. First letter I got. So the first letter, it's like my statement. It was from the doctors on the 9th of October. On the Saturday night, on Sunday morning, I got from the doctor. Very specific from you. Give me the email. Yeah, I gave him a draft. That's right, I wrote it.
There was more information in there about the detail of what was in the medical report. Obviously, for privacy reasons, we're not playing it. But let's hear that key line again from Leon Zweier.
Yeah, I gave him a draft. That's right, I wrote it.
This moment of Zweier saying that he wrote the medical report stood out for our witness who was in the bar. The medical report that Zweier claimed to have drafted was used when the ACT Director of Public Prosecutions, Shane Drumgold, announced he wouldn't proceed with a retrial of the rape charges against Lerman because of Higgins' fragile mental state. 10 days later, a one-day mediation took place between Higgins and the Commonwealth, which led to a deed of settlement where Higgins was paid $2.4 million. It's not clear whether the medical report prepared by Zweier was also submitted to the Commonwealth. Now, as you heard a bit earlier, Zweier raised the book inconsistencies as a topic that Whybrow may return to cross-examine Higgins on. This related to differences in accounts from Higgins' book that she was writing to the evidence she'd given in court. Higgins had already answered questions about her book the week before. Zweier said this of the book inconsistencies.
It's a literary flourish in terms of describing things. It's literary flourish.
To reiterate, there is no evidence indicating Brittany Higgins received or acted on any advice that Zweier gave Shiraz on the Monday evening. Higgins was under strict instructions not to talk about her testimony, and on the Tuesday morning she told Stephen Whybrow that she hadn't discussed it with anyone. In response to questions from Sky News, Leon Zweier said, "All my private conversations with David Shiraz and Emma Webster were on the common understanding that Brittany was under cross-examination and no one was to talk with her about the substance of her evidence or the manner in which she was giving it." Sky News also asked David Shiraz whether he passed on any of the advice that Zweier had given him to his fiancée. We didn't receive a response. Now, still to come after the break, journalist Paul Kelly breaks down the anti-Semitic rot in Australia that Labor is failing to get a handle of. Stay tuned. We're going to come back after this. Welcome back. The anti-Semitism crisis in Australia seems to be getting worse with each passing day. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese did not put the rising threat of violence against Jewish people and the lack of social cohesion on our streets on the agenda of his National Cabinet last week, despite Peter Dutton repeatedly urging him to do so. Nor in Albanese's column in The Australian today did he make any mention of how his government was going to help protect Australian Jews, including vulnerable children, from attack, when he was outlining his plans for next year. He's deliberately turning a blind eye to the explosion in racism that's happening under his watch. Foreign Minister Penny Wong is finally making a trip to Israel soon, but she's practically tripping over herself to mention that she'll be visiting the West Bank and neighbouring countries as well as being part of a peace mission to bring an end to the war. And so as Penny Wong keeps lecturing Israel about military tactics, the Albanese government turns away from what's happening in its own country where it is actually responsible. And we saw yet another weekend of pro-Palestinian marches in our major cities. 5,000 people turned up in Melbourne, chanting all the usual anti-Semitic chants that we hear at these protests. 6,500 people turned up in Sydney with signs demanding the end of Israeli occupation. Well, here are some of the Melbourne protesters openly calling for the end of Israel. I mean, calling for an intifada, calling for from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. As you know, these phrases openly call for the destruction of the Jewish state, and it's a clear appeal for the genocide of Jewish people. Now, this isn't just happening in Australia. As we spoke about last week, protests demanding genocide of Jews are being heard across the US too, and we showed you the footage inside the University of Pennsylvania. Like our Prime Minister, their university president also didn't think there was anything wrong with these chants. I mean, in Australia, no one is stopping these protests from happening. But finally, in the US, action was taken over the weekend. The president of UPenn, Liz McGill, resigned from her position. She said, finally, that words do matter. We haven't heard yet whether the presidents of the other two universities, including Harvard, are going to fall on their swords for their appalling testimony at Congress as well, where they all failed to say that calling for the genocide of Jews was against the university's code of conduct, against their harassment policies. Well, clearly Jews were no longer feeling safe on their campuses. Now, the Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, wrote a very important column on the weekend about this hypocrisy, this moral failure of the position that the left has taken. And it applies to whether it's politicians of the left or universities or even the arts. He wrote, and I quote, "The left is making a fatal moral mistake in embracing the Palestinian cause when it can't disentangle that cause from the violence intrinsic to the identity and meaning of Hamas as seen in its assault of October 7. And Paul Kelly quoted the New York University journalism professor Susie Linfield, who said that the Western left's response to October 7 will be viewed as a moment of moral corruption, on par with the defence of Stalin's purges, Czechoslovakia's anti-Semitic show trials of 1952, the Soviet invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and Poland's anti-Semitic expulsions of 1968, along with the denial of the Khmer Rouge's genocide and the adulation of China's vicious cultural revolution. Linfield wrote, "A left that is fixated on decolonisation mistakes a death cult for a liberation movement and is unable to recognise a bloodbath, even one that was filmed and publicised worldwide by the killers themselves." Paul Kelly also writes in his piece that Australian multiculturalism is going to face an examination of its character despite the near-deafening silence from most of its alleged champions. And Albanese's silence is the loudest of them all. Now, I'm thrilled to say that Paul Kelly joins me now. Welcome to the program, Paul. Thank you so much for your time and for your important work on this topic of the rising anti-Semitism.
Very good to be with you, Sharri.
Now, let's start with this moral confusion that the left finds itself in. What do you think is happening?
Well, look, I think that it's perfectly legitimate for the pro-Palestinian cause and for the left to protest and campaign against Israel's war, to campaign against the Israeli government. But this is a war between Israel and a terrorist organisation, Hamas, that stands for the liquidation of Israel and for the liquidation of the Jewish people in the Middle East. So clearly there is a fundamental moral question here. And I think if people are going to campaign on behalf of the Palestinian cause, then it's incumbent upon them to spell out precisely where they stand, and in particular spell out whether they disagree and dissent from the agenda of Hamas. Now, what's happened so far is to a large extent, both in Australia and much of the rest of the world, in terms of the street demonstrations and in terms of many prominent people supporting the Palestinian cause, they have not been prepared to make that distinction. There's a moral fudge there, and I think that's a fundamental issue. It's a fundamental political and it's a fundamental moral issue.
Now, you write in your piece how there's this rift on how Peter Dutton thinks that anti-Semitism should be handled and what's happening within the Albanese government. You cite that some politicians, including Tony Burke, but also you say the normally sensible Murray Watt, have been unable to condemn the protests at the Sydney Theatre Company. Can you talk to me about why the Albanese government finds it so difficult to unequivocally say anti-Semitism is not good enough and to actually put it on the national agenda and deal with it?
Well, I think this is a real problem, and I think it's going to be important in revealing the character of the Albanese government, and I think the government should reflect upon this. So the way I interpret the government's position at the moment, the government wants to play down this issue in the community, and it thinks that the best approach as far as the government is concerned is not to talk about it. Now, clearly, when there's an outrageous event, as we saw at the Crown Plaza Hotel in Melbourne a few weeks ago, then the Prime Minister quite properly speaks out against that. But I think the overall approach of the government is to try to play down the issue, keep people calm as much as possible. Then, to the extent that they want to talk about anti-Semitism, they want to be even-handed, and they link this all the time with Islamophobia, implying, of course, that there's an even-handed relationship and an even-handed connection there. Now, I think that is a distortion of the issue. I don't think that is an accurate presentation of the real issue. We know what's going on globally. We're seeing a very significant increase globally in anti-Semitism. I mean, this is a civilisational issue, and we're seeing it also in this country, although not as badly as we're seeing in some other Western nations. So I think the government has got to be very careful about the way it handles this. In relation to the Sydney Theatre Company, it's sad and pathetic to see senior ministers in the Albanese government not even able to take the stand the Sydney Theatre Company took against the antics of these actors and pretending, we have these ministers pretending that this is about artistic freedom. Well, that's nonsense. Most people know it's nonsense. And the fact that they can't even take a stand on this issue, which in some ways wasn't all that important. It would have been fairly easy to have taken a stand on that issue. They couldn't do it. Well, what's this tell you about the government?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I can say what I think it tells you about the government, which is that it doesn't seem to care about Jewish Australians. But I hope that's not the case. But there is no courage here. You also examine in two of your recent articles the role of universities in being the hotbeds of this anti-Semitism, this, anti-Israel sentiment, but it does go so far, and now Jews are not feeling safe on campuses. You spoke to Julian Lisa about this as well. What can be done in this situation? Do we need to see more leadership from university chiefs,
chancellors? Absolutely, we need to see more leadership. It's extraordinary. I mean, I spoke to Allegra Spender and Julian Lisa last week. They were both very firm on this issue. There is a fundamental problem in the university sector in this country. Julian Lisa referred to various surveys that have been done. It's clear that to a significant extent, Jewish students feel unsafe on campus. Not only do they feel unsafe on campus, but they feel the university leadership and the university administration will not provide proper support for them. So I don't think there's any doubt there's an issue. We've seen, of course, what's happened over recent days in the United States in relation to Penn, Harvard and MIT, where the leaders failed completely in the evidence they gave. And we've seen at Penn, the president and the chair of the board have had to resign. This is extraordinary. So anyone who thinks there's no moral crisis, well, that doesn't stand up at all. There's clearly a fundamental crisis, a fundamental moral crisis going on in some of the elite American institutions. And I think all the evidence and the surveys point to the fact there is a problem in the Australian university sector.
Look, the piece you wrote on anti-Semitism before this most recent one, you spoke to prominent Jewish Australians and other figures, and you detailed about how this anti-Semitism we're seeing in Australia truly is unprecedented for Australia. It's gotten so bad, and yet, as you just said a moment ago, Anthony Albanese and his ministers want to pretend it's not happening. They don't want to make a noise about this issue. I mean, you can't just look the other way and pretend a crisis isn't happening, that a crisis in social cohesion isn't happening.
I think there is a problem for the government here because there's clearly a very significant increase in anti-Semitism in this country of a dimension that has shocked many people, and we've had many prominent leaders of the Jewish community spell this out. We had in recent weeks that petition signed by hundreds of Australians, hundreds of prominent Australians, which made it very clear as far as they're concerned, this is an important issue, this is a fundamental issue, yet we see a lack of response from the government. Now, I don't want to be unfair to the government, but I think it is accurate and fair to say that there has been an inadequate response from the government. They have not responded to the issue as such, and the issue as such is the rising tenor of anti-Semitism in this country. And I think the government's got to be very, very conscious of the inadequacy of its present approach, which is to play down the issue and whenever it talks about it, just link it with discrimination against Islam and the Muslim community.
And it's not that there is never any Islamophobia, of course not. And it's not that it's not an important issue, of course it is. But, you know, you can't equate the two. We aren't seeing people driving through suburbs where there's a high Muslim population intimidating them and terrifying them, which is what's happening to the Jewish community. You know, we've seen protests outside of synagogues. I revealed last week a group of 4 13-year-olds at the local shopping centre. You know, there was an incident with a swastika box thrown at them. It's every single day. Paul, just before you'd go, I'd love to get your reflections more broadly on the Albanese government. We're about midway or potentially more, 2/3, depending on when the election is called, through its term. It had a long honeymoon, a very extended honeymoon, but it ends the year in a disastrous position. Where do you think this is heading next year?
I don't think it's in a disastrous position, Sharri, but I think it's in a pretty difficult position where a lot of support for the government has certainly evaporated, and the government's got really serious structural problems. What the government has got to do is it's got to shift the focus very much to the economy. But the problem it's got with the economy is that these are structural issues. Whether we're talking now about inflation, interest rates, cost of living, per capita income, there's going to be no easy solution to those issues. So while it's got to focus on the economy, it's going to be hard to actually deliver immediate benefits or benefits before the next election when it comes to the economy. But I think analysing the situation, we've got to draw a distinction between the Albanese government getting into difficulty, and it certainly has, and thinking that this naturally translates into support for the Peter Dutton-led coalition. I don't think that's the case. And I think this is the problem with quite a lot of the analysis at the moment. I think what we're going to see at the next election is a significant increase in the vote for third parties and independents. That is, I think Albanese will lose support. Some of that support will go to Peter Dutton, but a significant amount of that support will go to third parties and independents. So at this stage, I'd say the threat to Albanese...
in Liberal seats or in some Labor seats as well, the Teals?
So at this stage, it seems to me, the real threat is not so much that Albanese will lose the Prime Ministership at the next election, but he may well be forced into minority government. That would be a really significant setback for him. After one term to be thrown into minority government. That, I think, would be a very good result for the coalition and a pretty grim outcome for the Labor Party.
Paul Kelly, I so appreciate your analysis as always, and thank you so much once again for your excellent reporting. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharri.
Coming up, Joe Hildebrand and Andrew Carswell will break down the race to replace Anastasia Palaszczuk as Queensland's Labor leader. That's after the break. Welcome back. If you're just tuning in, here are the top 5 stories you need to know tonight. As Sydney Court has heard, it took so long for AFP agents to obtain security ports and CCTV from the night Brittany Higgins and Bruce Lerman entered Parliament that it had to go up the chain of command. The government launches its new migration policy overhaul after a record 510,000 migrants landed on our shores this year. There'll be a fight to replace Anastasia Palaszczuk as Queensland's Premier, with the state's Health Minister challenging Deputy Stephen Miles for the top job. Police have charged the man who was behind the wheel of an SUV that crashed into a pub in country Victoria last month, when 5 people, including 2 children, lost their lives. And the opposition leader is calling on the Prime Minister to intervene after the UK High Commissioner cancelled London's Australia Day Gala over sensitivities. Well, as you know by now, Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk sensationally resigned on the weekend, giving a tearful nod to who she thinks her successor should be.
Oh, look, I've been thinking about it for a while. Sorry, I wasn't going to get upset today. I've been thinking about it for a while, and it's the right time. And it's time for renewal. It's, I have a great deputy in Stephen Miles, and I believe he'll make an excellent Premier.
A report in the Australian newspaper today claims that Palaszczuk caved into factional pressure from both within the Labor Party and from union bosses. Right now, the 2 contenders to replace her are Queensland Health Minister Shannon Fentiman and Deputy Premier Stephen Miles. Well, joining me to discuss this, as always on a Monday night, Director of Headline Advisory Andrew Carswell and Sky News contributor Joe Hildebrand.
Hello.
Thank you to you both. Joe,
Pleasure.
So what's happened behind the scenes here, according to these reports?
What hasn't happened behind the scenes? So this stuff is so fun, right? So basically this all goes back, believe it or not, to Kevin Rudd and his comeback in 2013, where he said, I will only come back if you introduce a new rule that says you cannot knife a sitting leader unless you have 60% in opposition or 75% if they're the PM. And then when you do have a leadership contest after that, it has to be weighted between 50% rank and file, so the branches, the standard membership of the Labor Party, and 50% caucus members, right? So this was meant to make it all nice and free and democratic and give the grassroots a say in the leadership. Of course, very quickly, the Labor Party realised that if the grassroots has any say in the leadership, the leader that they select is going to be the most extreme, crazy, ridiculous, whatever. So suddenly they realised the last thing we can ever do is let the grassroots have a say in this. So from now on in every single leadership contest, including the last federal one, Victoria, New South Wales, WA, you name it, the deal is all stitched up behind closed doors. There's not even a vote in caucus. The leadership team is presented to caucus as a fait accompli. So that is what is happening here. And you've got Stephen Miles, who obviously thinks he's the leader in waiting. He's got the support of Gary Bullock, who is the head of the influential left-wing union that used to be the Liquor, Hospitality and Miscellaneous Workers Union, fondly known as the MISOs. It's now called United Workers Union or something.
Yeah.
But of course, he would be a disastrous choice because he has all the baggage of Anastasia Palaszczuk and absolutely none of the charm.
I mean, it's so interesting because, Palaszczuk has obviously been a long-serving Premier. She was fighting to hang on to her job. We saw all the reports for months now that people were trying to get her to move on. She was refusing to go. But in the end, Andrew Carswell, it comes down to the faceless, factional men behind the scenes, the union bosses, saying, your time's up.
Well, surprise, surprise, Sharri. Well, as Joe said, the Queensland Labor Party, particularly the left faction, are completely beholden to their union bosses. For 12 years, the Premier went into her office and picked up the phone every day. And on the other end of the line were the union bosses themselves. She didn't do anything without their say. What to say, where to go, who to appoint in cabinet, what to have for lunch. Anything that happened on any given day was ordered by the unions. And we won't see that change in this process as well, particularly if they go to Stephen Miles. I agree, he's not the right choice given the baggage that he carries from those COVID years. And this guy was the attack dog. Against everything the federal government did. He gnashed his teeth, he puffed out his chest, and he had a swing at the federal government at every attempt. So if he gets the role, he'll need to reinvigorate himself. And we've seen that in the past. We all remember, when Peter Dutton put his hand up for the leadership and went out and into the courtyard with a press conference and said, now I can smile again. The problem is, I don't think I've ever seen Stephen Miles smile. I'm not sure he's even capable of it. So a complete reset is needed here for the government here to retain power.
Look, the peculiar thing to many of us outside of Queensland, and actually even outside of Melbourne, is how governments that were so tough during COVID lacked empathy, caused so many problems with their approach, then got voted back in.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, it goes to a bigger ideological problem with the left of the Labor Party, which is precisely that it is a faction that is based on ideology and that it doesn't compromise that ideology for even the most obvious practical human reasons. And so, of course, you have this extremely hardline response in both Victoria and Queensland. And even when there are cases, like with, people with sick or dying family members or children or whatever, they say, oh, no, Queensland hospitals are for Queenslanders, or the borders must be closed because we have to do it for Mother Russia. And that is a real problem. And again, at least in Victoria, it was a left. What's strange that in Victoria you had the right used to have the numbers, and Dan Andrews from the left faction ruled at the right's pleasure. And then, of course, that got completely swept aside when the branch stacking scandal came up, and suddenly that state flipped to the left. Queensland is the exact opposite. The left has the numbers. Stephen Miles is the big architect, I suppose, of the left, and has Gary Bullock from the union sort of pulling his strings in the background. But Anastasia Palaszczuk is of the right. So basically, Palaszczuk served only at the left's pleasure, which is why whether she wanted to go or not was a completely moot point. If the left decided she wasn't electorally popular enough to be worth having around, she was gone, and that's that. And so that's why I think those were probably not just crocodile tears.
But what do you think, Andrew, about the proposition now that this does give the opposition a look in at the next election in Queensland?
Oh, I certainly think that is the case. And it's not because of a growing hatred of Anastasia Palaszczuk. I think quite the opposite. I still think there's a level of respect there from the public in Queensland. And you rightly said it, those outside of Queensland will never get that, will never understand why they voted for her the way they did, particularly through COVID. But it would be a mistake to say now that she's the reason why the opposition in Queensland are doing so well. I just think it's just that she lost her way a little bit. It's not because they don't like her. It's because she lost her mojo. She focused on other things. She didn't focus on the rising crime issues in Queensland. She didn't focus on cost of living. She loved the red carpet. So it wasn't a pushback against COVID. They loved what she did in COVID. We'll never understand it, but they loved it. It is a pushback against a 12-year-old government that needs to move on.
OK, let's move on to this migration story today. The Albanese government says it's cracking down on temporary migration visas after our annual intake of new migrants hit a record high of 510,000 people this year. That's more than the population of Darwin, Hobart and Cairns combined, I'm told. The new migration strategy will lift English language requirements. It'll make it harder for international students to prove their education status. And they say that the government's going to restrict onshore visa hopping. Joe, what confuses me about this is the Albanese government has clearly had a big Australia policy. They brought in a record number of migrants this year, and now suddenly they're saying they're going to return to normal levels. It feels like the government's policies are chopping and changing. They don't know what they want Australia to look like.
There's a couple of things here. To be fair to Claire O'Neill, who has had a shocker of a month, right from the get-go, she said that she was going to have a look at the migration intake and make sure that it was genuinely skilled workers. And of course, Labor has a dog in this fight because the last thing the unions want, and we've just seen in the last story how influential the unions are still over the Labor Party, is unskilled workers coming in and undercutting the value of Australian labour, because that hurts their members. So even if, you can be as cynical as you want, but even if you just look at naked self-interest, there is no reason why the government would want to bring in workers unless they were desperately needed to fill skills shortages and to prevent the economy from hitting kind of bottlenecks or roadblocks. So you've got to make sure that every worker you bring in from overseas is actually creating jobs by unlocking roadblocks in industry that were preventing economic growth, right? And so, it's big business that really wants a big Australia and wants a huge pool of labour market, because that devalues the price of labour. So I think the Albanese government has been smart in making this announcement before Christmas, because it has huge cost of living significance. And you look at the crackdown on overseas students, for example, which is where most of this looks like it's going to be focused. International students, it is a big export market. I think it's Australia's third biggest export market, selling our education. But of course, they come in, they take up rental accommodation, and we know that that is under huge amounts of pressure.
Yes.
They are often unskilled labourers, so they will take up low-paid jobs and drive down the cost of Australian labour. And of course, it's long been an anecdotal complaint that they bring down the overall standard of education at universities because their English language skills aren't good enough, and so the class ends up sort of going to their level instead of at the level of local students. So I think it's a no-brainer. I think it's a good win for the government, and good on them for announcing it.
Well, look, I want to pick up on that theme that you just raised about the housing crisis and the pressure on rent from the high number of immigrants that we've had. The issue is, and we keep talking about on this program, that the high immigration levels are contributing to the high inflation. It's putting pressure on the housing market. Andrew Carswell, the high immigration has technically kept Australia out of a recession, but it has meant as well that inflation has been more difficult to get under control. We heard in recent weeks that the RBA governor has said that inflation is now a homegrown problem. So do you think the government's change of strategy on the migration levels is partly to address this issue of inflation with, the RBA making it clear it's a homegrown problem, the rental crisis isn't helping. Part of the pressure on that is from all the immigrants that come to Australia.
Yeah, I think there could be no mistake that this is an attempt of a political reset. They've had a shocker of 6 months, and this is the populist policy that they're pulling out at the last minute to try and win back some of that support. And there's nothing wrong with the policy that was announced today. I think there's some merit in that. But they're trying to clean up their own mess. And where I have a problem with the policy today is not the policy substance, but at the policy rhetoric. They are continuing to blame the previous government for what they see as loopholes and loose processes within within the immigration program. But this is the government that, when they came to power, opened the floodgates on our borders. This is the government that let in 500,000 migrants in 1 year, in the same time as there is a cost of living crisis, a housing crisis, and in the same year that they took the scissors to infrastructure projects around the country. So trying to get a grasp of where they're going here is difficult. And I keep coming back to the fact that this is a political fix to try and get themselves out of the doldrums they currently are in. Because the policy, let's face it, the policy is fine and people will love it. People would love a cut to immigration, particularly in the suburbs. And I've always thought that this government lives and dies on how it responds to big Australia and the impacts on cost of living.
Well, look, we saw just last week that the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, hit out at our Sky News colleague, Olivia Casely, when she dared to ask Joe whether he should apologise to the victims of, or the alleged victims rather, of those who have allegedly reoffended since being let out of immigration detention. He, said that was an absurd question. Of course it's not. The Albanese government didn't have legislation ready to go for the for the scenario
right.
that the High Court was going to rule indefinite detention was unlawful. So he blew up at that press conference last week, and yet today, Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neil has apologised. She did an exclusive interview with the Herald Sun where she said, "I'm certainly sorry that crimes have been committed by perpetrators who belong to this cohort of people and anyone else in the community." She said, "You can't read a newspaper and hear about crimes being committed like this and not feel anything." So, Joe, a blow up
great. No,
with a
good on her
suggestion
for
of an
apologising.
apology last week from Dreyfus, and now she's apologising.
Yeah, I mean, she should have done it probably about 4 weeks ago, or whenever it was. This thing has dragged on way too long. It is an exercise in everything what not to do in terms of crisis management. And if we just go through and good on her for apologising, that's fantastic. But again, just think about all the unnecessary pain and suffering the government could have avoided if that had happened right on. So initially, of course, we had the government coming out and saying, well, none of this is our fault. It's probably the previous government's fault. And, the High Court has done all this, but there's nothing we can do because we've got to wait for the reasons to come out. Then suddenly, after Richard Marles gets involved, the acting leader, because Albo is overseas, he says, no, we are getting on this right now. Suddenly they're doing deals with Peter Dutton. Basically, everything Peter Dutton asks for, he gets immediately. And this legislation is rushed through the Parliament, so they're monitoring devices. Of course, as I said at the time, if just one of these detainees offends again, this is going to be just a world of pain for the government. That's not a particularly sophisticated observation to make, but I do know that was the first thing that popped into my head. Sure enough, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think maybe 6 now. 5,
allegedly
maybe it's 5.
reoffending.
Alleged reoffences.
Yes.
And again, this has been allowed to bleed and bleed and bleed, and the government has been defensive about it. It has been saying that it's everyone's fault except theirs. What it should have done is completely repositioned itself, been all over the High Court like a cheap suit, been preparing the legislation in response, which should have been in their back pocket the whole time, because it turns out they weren't 3 months ago. But to blame the previous government, to blame the High Court, and then to blame the journo for asking the question about it is the worst thing you can do. If a bad thing happens in government, your job is to be the person who is angriest at that thing, not the messenger, not the person asking questions about it or telling you about it. That you have to be more outraged than the public about that scandal. That's the only way the public will trust that you're actually going to deal with it.
Andrew Carswell, I mean, it's interesting because we saw that attack on Peter Dutton. They were all saying that he was protecting pedophiles. This has been an apology a long time in the making.
And look, it's not the only thing that they should be apologising for as well. I mean, they were absolutely caught napping here. So apologise, yes, for those that are victims of crime in the community as a result of this apology, but also apologise for the fact that you weren't ready for it. Apologise for the fact that you saw this coming as a government and you didn't have policy in place to implement as soon as the High Court made their decision, and effectively ensure that the policy remained intact in some form. That's what you should be apologising for.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, Joe Hildebrand, Andrew Carswell, thank you both so much. We'll see you. Oh, we won't see you next Monday. We're having a 4-week break. So
happy Christmas, happy Hanukkah.
Happy Christmas and Hanukkah. It's been great to have you guys on the show this year.
Thanks, Sharri.
We'll see you next year.
Thanks, Sharri.
Now, if you missed my big scoop at the start of the show, head to the Sky News website. We had exclusive tapes of Brittany Higgins' lawyer. You do not want to miss that story. Head to the Sky News website, our exclusive from the start of the show. I'll be back at 5 o'clock tomorrow. This whole week, we're going to have big exclusives, so don't miss the show. After the break, James Morrow will be filling in for Peter Credlin. See you tomorrow.